Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Kretschmer. I'm glad to be here with you today at the Virtus Chem webinar. We have some wonderful speakers talking about risk assessment during green and sustainable product development, and you'll hear from them in a moment. Before I introduce our speakers, two things to note. As you know, we are recording today's session. It'll be available at a later date on the Virtus Chem website, and you'll see some poll questions, and we'd love for you to answer those. Now, before we hear from our speakers, I want to introduce Virtus Chem's CEO, Neelam Vaidya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Laurie. Welcome to the webinar. We are very happy to see that about 80 people have joined, registered for the webinar. Hope to see them all. And I think we are going to have a very exciting discussion. Our next webinar will be end of March or April, beginning of April. So stay tuned for that too. Laurie, go ahead.
Thanks so much. And let me tell you a little bit about our speakers. We have some wonderful speakers today talking about risk assessment during green and sustainable product development. And after you hear from each of them, you'll have an opportunity for Q&A. You'll also on screen see some poll questions. We would love to get your responses on this topic. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Michael Schultz. After many years of leading companies in their process improvement efforts, Michael started his own consulting firm, that's PTI Global Solutions, and it brings engineering expertise to sustainable technology to help companies accelerate their commercialization. And Michael has more than 45 US patents. He's published many papers, and he even won the Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge in 2015. He's going to talk to us about managing risk while scaling green chemistry. Then after Michael, we're going to hear from Dr. Craig Rowlands, a senior scientist and toxicologist at Underwriters Laboratories, which is better known to all as UL. Craig has been driving R&D for 20 years in human health toxicology, evidence integration, causation analysis, and risk assessment. And he's published a number of papers, including on adverse outcome pathways, which he'll be talking about today, that's AOP, and emerging technologies in chemical safety assessment and sustainability. Thank you to both of you for joining us. And now we're going to start with Michael Schultz on managing risk while scaling green chemistry. Take it away, Michael.
Just a quick reminder, everyone, that the link for the survey will be in the chat box. So whenever you want to, you can do that too.
Great, thanks. Back to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Lori. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to talk today about my views on managing risks while scaling green chemistry. I've had the chance throughout my career, through more than 20 years in industry, to scale up the number of products and process technologies across a range of industries, from refining and petrochemical to biotechnology to specialty chemicals. And there are a number of commonalities that cover all of those efforts. And so I'd like to speak to that today. The challenge of scale up is well known. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and there's a lot of risk. I like to think about the triangle of time, cost, and risk, and how can we effectively manage those trade-offs. Usually you have to trade off one for the other. I don't think it's possible to completely eliminate risk, and in fact, when we're doing something novel and breakthrough, there's inherently risk involved. So I like to think about this as how do we manage that risk effectively. And in fact, I think to give the greatest chance of success, we have to accept some risk and strategically accept some risk in order to accelerate commercialization. Often timeline is the key driver. And so we need to accept and manage some risk. And so that's what I'll speak about today over the next few minutes. So there's really three key components when we think about scaling up a new product or a new process technology. And so the first of these is to assess your risk. You really need to understand what risks are inherent to the green chemistry innovation that you are working on. And by better understanding the risks that you have, you can work on mitigation efforts and also prioritize your efforts on the greatest risk to scaling your technology. Next, I think it's important to decouple scale-up parameters. As we think about moving from lab to pilot to demo and commercial, I don't think it's valuable to try to evaluate every parameter at every scale. Usually it's more efficient to look at the science-based parameters, chemistry, biology, electrochemistry at the smaller scales, and focus on engineering parameters such as heat transfer and mass transfer at the larger scales. By decoupling those parameters, it gives you a more efficient route to scale up. And then finally, it's critical to generate multi-scale data, invest in hours on stream, and to do that throughout your scale-up process. So then along the way, we can use mitigation tools to help us manage our risk, modeling and analysis. And I'm also a big believer in bringing process engineering into the scale-up process early on. So before we get into the details of this, I've had the chance to develop some philosophies over the years that have helped me along the way. The first is that product equals data. So I usually think that at whatever scale you're operating at, usually the product is the data that you're generating. Sure, sometimes you need to generate product quantities for qualification, et cetera, but just I encourage you to think about the data set at each scale that you're operating at. So what is the data set you're targeting? In addition to just proving, say, I can make this product at this scale. Next, I think it's more efficient to save integration for larger scale. This can help you to focus your resources and experiments appropriately for the scale. It's of course important to understand the integration between the process units and your technology, but usually that information is more valuable at larger scales. And then modeling complementing R&D. Clearly, we need experimental data, and models can help enhance that. So models can enhance our understanding of the data we're getting. It also can reduce the number of experiments we need because we can use models to predict performance and also help guide us into the direction we need to go to get that next data point. Leverage partners. So think about what you really need to do internally, what can you do externally, either outsourcing some of your development, or even more valuable, getting commercialization partners early on to help you drive your commercialization. And then finally, commercial potential. Something technically interesting is not as important without those market and economic drivers. So the first tool I like to use is a risk assessment tool. So we put together a risk assessment that helps us identify risks and develop mitigations. So I'm showing a simple example here with 3 items. You may have 15, 20, 25, et cetera. But the idea is you look at different risk areas, so technical risk, maybe plant operations, commercial, there may be supply chain risks, IP risks, et cetera. But then as a group, look to identify the risks in each of these areas. So what could go wrong, or what are the unanswered questions? The next step is to assign scores to these risks. So using a probability and impact rating, and multiplying these together to get a score. Now, when scoring these, I like to just use a high, medium, or low score, usually a 1, a 3, or a 9. to try to say, is this a 3 or a 3.5 or a 4? That's a waste of time. You're really trying to bucket your risks into high scores, medium and low. And so for anything that scores at some criteria, then you need to develop a mitigation plan. So have a very targeted mitigation for that risk. And then it's very important to have a specific person owning that and a timeline for completion. Without these can sometimes just go off into the ether. And then you use this tool, you track it over time. Hopefully your mitigations will bring these scores down, and as you're moving forward, you can rescore these risk items and continue to drive the risk scores down as you move through your scale up process. The next thing is to decouple your scale up parameters. I think it's important to use the right tools for the data you're trying to get at a particular scale. And usually what this means is that the intrinsic science-based data, it's more useful to use smaller scale equipment to generate those, looking at process inputs and the impact on kinetics, what are the impacts on of contaminants on your process, et cetera. At larger scales, the data will be more useful for things such as mass transfer and heat transfer. Often it's good to do some modeling of these engineering parameters early on so you know what to look for. But by decoupling these parameters, you're not trying to do everything at every scale, and it provides a bit more efficiency and allows you to accelerate that scale up effort. And then generating multi-scale data. There's no the investing in hours on stream is critical, and by that I mean tens of thousands of hours collectively over lab, pilot, and demo. I sometimes hear people talk about having 500 hours or 1,000 hours invested in a technology. I don't think that's enough. It's critical to really invest in those hours on stream to de-risk your technology. Finding the right balance between directed R&D and experimental freedom. I'm a big believer in setting targets for R&D, but I'm aware that especially doing something breakthrough and novel, you can't over prescribe to really great creative scientists what they need to do. So there's got to be some balance between that. Again, multi-scale capability throughout scale up. So as you move from lab to pilot to demonstration plant, don't shut down those smaller scales. Usually really effective to use your labs and pilots for troubleshooting and ongoing process improvement. Good planning to leverage multiple assets. Maybe you have multiple research facilities or pilots with different capabilities. Think about those multiple assets collectively and how you can use them to achieve a particular outcome. And don't forget about external resources. You may not need to do everything internally either. And then finally, at each scale, where do you need product samples? How much do you need? And how much data do you need? So think through that a bit. Digging a bit further into multi-scale data, we can think about sequential technology development. So maybe we start on something in maybe we start on something in the lab. We do a lot of work. We drive towards our commercial targets, and we say, great. Now let's set up our pilot. So we shut down our lab. We now start out our pilot. We're learning and developing data. Get to commercial performance, and now we're ready to move to commercial. We shut down our pilot. So this may ultimately be the lowest risk approach, but it is going to be the longest timeline. So because often timeline is driving what we're trying to do, I think that it is reasonable and important even to take some strategic risk and to accelerate your scale up So this means a couple of things. One is that we can start at the lab scale, do some work, but then start planning the pilot even before we've hit our commercial target. So we're essentially planning for success. We're not just closing our eyes and hoping things work out, but by planning things appropriately, we can start our pilot stage even before we hit our commercial targets in the lab. Same thing moving to demo or commercial. So it's planning for success and taking some risk to move forward and in exchange for accelerating your timeline. The other key thing is that don't just shut down your lab because you're at pilot scale. Don't just shut down your pilot because now you've got your demo or first commercial up and running. These smaller scale assets can be critical for troubleshooting. Maybe you're seeing maybe you're starting up your commercial plant and you're seeing things you didn't expect. You can go and test raw materials or different process conditions to do some troubleshooting at the smaller scale. You can also do ongoing process improvement, which can ultimately accelerate your path to commercial success. And so finally, just talking about some tools that we can use to help to mitigate risk as we move forward. I'm a big believer in using models and analysis. So models can be everything from techno-economic models, process models using process simulators like Aspen. We can do detailed reaction models or reactor models, CFD models. These all have their time and place, but I like to always think about this quote from George Box, who is a British statistician who liked to say all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's really ultimately the point. We're not trying to make a perfect model. We need to make sure that the model we're generating is useful to us in our scale-up effort. So what does this mean? Well, models should be tools that can help complement experiments and help direct future opportunities. So we can use models to say, well, what's that next piece of data we need to get? We also don't need to wait for a perfect model before using it in our scale-up work. We can refine our model as we gain more data. And then a model is most effective when we have that multi-scale data. And I even find that modeling can be useful even before we start exploratory R&D. So this is an example of a project I worked on where we developed a process model. We integrated it with an economic model and used it to evaluate some trade-offs in the bioreactor performance versus cost. This helped us set the design conditions for the bioreactor and ultimately set targets for future data generation. And then finally, I'm a big believer in bringing engineering into the scale-up effort early on, even as we're starting to draw the block flow diagram on the page. So things we can do with process engineering, some of the technical risks we may face include off-spec product. So we can put together process models to help prioritize the R&D, evaluate trade-offs in key variables, and develop product specifications. Another risk, of course, is always that we're going to miss our cost targets. Things are going to cost too much. So by bringing process engineering in early, we can really understand what are those cost drivers of our technology. Maybe we have some things built in that are nice to have versus critical. So things like that, process engineering can help us identify those cost reduction opportunities that we may need to implement it as we move forward. And then finally, there's always a risk and a concern that that commercial project is going to miss the timeline. One way to mitigate that risk is to try to anticipate engineering needs early. So often we will not see heat effects or the impact of pressure drop, let's say at lab or even pilot scale. By doing that engineering early, we can plan for that. So we're not taking time when we're doing detailed engineering to start putting those mitigation factors into place. So just to conclude, again, the three key pieces I like to use to manage risk during scale up. One is to assess your risk, make sure you know what risks you have, so you can prioritize your mitigation efforts going forward. Decoupling your scale up parameters so you know what you're trying to accomplish at each scale, and generating multi-scale data. So my contact information is here. I'd be happy to talk with you more offline, and appreciate your time. Thank you.